Christians would just rather think it's not there and just sort of gloss over it instead of dealing with the text that's actually there. Well, but I think the same thing's true about Judas. That here you got this, for most people, if you ask them what happens to Judas, and I was really curious when I was watching the movie Passion of the Christ, which ending were they going to choose for Judas? Right?
Yes, it's always the thing, because all the Jesus movies that portray Judas dying, you have to make a decision because there are two accounts of his death. And I think almost all the movies follow the account in Matthew, which is that Judas, after he betrayed Jesus, went out and hanged himself.
But that's boring.
Well, it's boring, but you can show it. The other one is a little bit more interesting, but it's hard to figure out what it's talking about, because in the book of Acts, chapter 1, Judas doesn't hang himself. What happens is he falls headlong, and he apparently he kind of splits open, and he pours his bowels out on the ground, and he dies that way. So so there are two different accounts of his death, and they're both related to something called a field of blood. In Matthew's gospel, Judas' death is related to the field of blood because he returns the money that he got for betraying Jesus, and the priests buy a temple that they called a field of blood because it was purchased with blood money that Judas had gotten for the deed. But in the book of Acts, it's called the field of blood because he bleeds all over it, and so he bloodies it. So these are very different accounts that I think are probably impossible to reconcile.
Well, I like the Judas explodes version of myself. I've always been a fan of that. And I've yet to see that portrayed in a movie. I'm waiting kind of for Michael Bay or somebody to do, some like special effects Hollywood guy to really do the Jesus story and really show Judas breaking in two, as like standing there and falling apart. And yet, usually, if you ask somebody to reconcile it, they'll say, this is my favorite, that he hanged himself but survived it, and then kind of with the rope still around his neck, because he'd been hanging there for so long that his guts were all being pushed down, and so therefore he walked out to the middle of the field, and then he split in two.
Yeah, people have all sorts of ways of reconciling it, or else, that he did a kind of a swan dive off of a cliff when the hanging didn't work, and so that's how he fell headlong, is that he first tried to hang himself, then he jumped off a cliff or some other thing. But there's no way to reconcile the accounts because of the difference of why it's called the field of blood.
Right. The specificity of that is what throws it off. Well, then, okay, now some people would look at that and they go, okay, well, you see, this is crazy Christianity. This is why I can't be a Christian. I'm going to be a Gnostic, because at least the Gnostics all agreed on everything, and that they were completely railroaded by the Christian church, and that they were a separate but a much saner version of Christianity. And so I'm going to follow that group of Christians in Gnostic Christians, as they write about in the Da Vinci Code. What's wrong with that theory?
Well, there's lots of things wrong with it. I mean, it's true that Gnostics were railroaded by the Christians. I mean, that's a little severe, but that's basically what happened. But I mean, by the non-Gnostic Christians, because the Gnostics, of course, considered themselves to be the true Christians. But to say that the Gnostics agreed with each other is so far wrong. I mean, when you read the Gnostic books, there are wide differences among the Gnostics. So much so that a lot of scholars today are refusing even to give the various Gnostic religions the same title. A lot of scholars are saying we can't even talk about Gnosticism anymore because these texts are so different from each other that there's no unity there at all.
And I had this discussion with somebody the other day who was telling me, oh, no, I'm a Gnostic, and it's the same unbroken tradition since the year zero. And I'm thinking, you're nuts, because I mean, some Gnostics, right? They believed in absolutely, they were complete aesthetics, no sex, no food, and then other people were completely different. It was as much sex as you could have. I mean, they weren't the same. I mean, they were
even basic tenets like how many gods are there, and how this world came into existence and who Jesus is. They disagreed on all of these things. So I think what happens is, after they discovered all these Gnostic texts in the 1940s, there were people who thought these texts were really cool, and so they started these Gnostic churches. But there's not a historical lineage, so that you can't really trace a historical connection between the ancient Gnostics and modern people who call themselves Gnostic. It's only with the rediscovery of these texts that people started taking on this Gnostic religion.
Well, and then, of course, in fiction, where you have a lot of people putting an emphasis on this Jesus as a survivor of the crucifixion, and then eventually the father of children with Mary Magdalene. They moved to France, and you have any number of different things that come out through that is considered to be the true church. That was that one tradition that survived is the one that comes up through the Da Vinci Code. Can you talk about that at all?
Yeah, it's unfortunate that a lot of people get their history of early Christianity from the Da Vinci Code. I tell my students that if they want to learn about the Middle Ages, the way to do that is not to watch Monty Python and the Search for the Holy Grail.
Right.
And the way to learn about early Christianity is not by reading the Da Vinci Code, which, people vary on their opinions about it as a book, but historically it gets almost all of its information wrong about Jesus and Mary Magdalene and the Emperor Constantine and the development of Christianity. So, I think that it in fact just kind of perpetuates a lot of misconceptions that are out there about what was going on with early Christianity.
I like the Da Vinci Code, and I'm looking forward to Angels and Demons. I like them for works of fiction, but to me, the Da Vinci Code is to Christian history what the Ian Fleming James Bond novels are to the history of the Cold War.
You're bursting some bubbles here.
Yeah, but it happened, and it's cool, but it doesn't have to have happened like that.
Yes, exactly. Right.
All right. So, but then the interesting part about those Gnostic texts is it does give us something like the Gospel of Thomas, which is an often discussed, still somewhat controversial text of a collection of sayings that are attributed to Jesus, some of which appear in the regular New Testament canon. But some people say, well, that should have been included in the Bible, that the Gospel of Thomas has the same pedigree as some of the other books that were included, but it was kept out due to politics within the church. Where are you with that?
Well, I don't think that this question about what should have been included is a very fruitful one. The members of the Jesus Seminar, this collection of this group of scholars that get together to debate what originally goes back to Jesus, they published a book called The Five Gospels, which were Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, and Thomas, because they too thought that Thomas was worth including, I guess. And Thomas is certainly a very interesting book. It contains 114 sayings of Jesus, about half of which were previously unknown. The other half have parallels in the New Testament, although they're not exactly the same. And so scholars have found it to be a very interesting book, both because it might contain some sayings of Jesus that we previously didn't know, and because it gives us some insight into what another Christian community was thinking and saying about Jesus. And it's my view that it's a Gnostic text that in fact contains some of the Gnostic teachings of Jesus, and so it helps us understand better another form of Gnosticism.
But what form of Gnosticism is that, then?
Well, that's the great question, because a lot of scholars now are refusing to call it Gnostic at all, because the Gospel of Thomas doesn't spell out what is typically thought of as the Gnostic myth about how the world came into existence. But my view is that we really don't know much about this. My guess is that the community behind the Gospel of Thomas was a set community, just like the community behind the Gospel of John. And the only way to reconstruct what this community was like and what it thought is through the Gospel of Thomas itself. And so I don't think that you can label it as being, one of the known Gnostic groups like the Sethian Gnostics or the Valentinian Gnostics. It was its own kind of group, I think.
Okay. Jesus Interrupted is the name of the new book from Bart Ehrman, revealing the hidden contradictions in the Bible and why we don't know about them. Let's talk about that part next, why we don't know about them. And then we'll get to your questions coming up. I promise you'll get in on this conversation on Coast to Coast AM. This is Ian Punnet.